All right, good morning, everyone. Welcome to Coverings. We're about to kick this off with what we believe is going to be an interesting discussion for you. This is going to be very much a panel discussion, and look forward to introducing you guys all to an all-star lineup we have here on stage in the field of sustainability. From my left to right, we have Wes Sullins from USGBC, Mr. William Paddock from WAP Sustainability, Teresa McGrath from the Healthy Building Network, and Mr. Vaslav, I won't even try, from Building Transparency. But what we're going to talk to you guys today about are kind of what's front and center in sustainability, and also we're going to engage in a nice conversation on what the industry is doing well, maybe what some challenges are for us in the months and years ahead. You know, there's a lot going on in sustainability, a very visible backdrop of embodied carbon, which is very much government and policy driven. But all of the usual green building topics that we become so accustomed to, like recycled content and certification and transparency, EPDs, and health. So we're going to talk about all of those, and I think when you walk away from today's session, you'll learn quite a bit about the industry and where we are, which we believe we're in a pretty strong position, and we have a good foundation to continue moving forward. So that said, I'm going to move down the line here and ask each of the panelists just to say a few words about yourself, and then we'll get it kicked off.
Okay. I'm Wes Sullins, as you said, with the U.S. Green Building Council, where I lead our materials and resources. And prior to that, I worked in local government for a number of years on green building programs. But I've been at USGBC for 7 years, and I'll pass it over to William.
Good morning, everybody. William Paddock. I'm a co-founder and managing director of a group called WAP Sustainability. Our primary role is working with manufacturers to help navigate different sustainability chores like LCAs and EPDs, material health work like HPDs and declare labels, and then sustainability certifications like Green Squared or Cradle to Cradle and things like that. Outside of our manufacturing work, we've started to do more and more with big owners who are trying to use that information, both private, large asset owners, or even governments, to make sense of like embodied carbon information or material health in the context of a building. So we'll probably talk a little bit more about that today, but great to see everybody. Happy Coverings.
Hi, Teresa McGrath with Healthy Building Network. My background is in chemistry and toxicology, so I've kind of always worked in the green chemistry space, whether that's for government, NGO, industry, or currently with Healthy Building Network. And we have 25 years of experience researching what's in building materials, what are the human health and environmental concerns throughout the building material life cycle, and giving guidance, creating guidance for purchasers of building materials on how to choose safer materials.
Hi everyone, again my name is Václav Hasek. I am the program director at Building Transparency. My background is in civil and environmental engineering, and I worked in an architecture firm and then sustainability consulting around building certification. I was always in sustainability, but with Building Transparency we focus particularly on carbon, on embodied carbon. We started with the Embodied Carbon and Construction Calculator tool, which is an open access database of environmental and product declarations, and allowing architects and engineers to really have easy access to some of the embodied carbon data. And so I'm excited to talk to you guys a little bit more about that today.
Great, thanks, Vaslav. So you can see we have a very well-rounded discussion here. So just to give you a little overview, we're going to kick things off with a kind of overview of the green building industry, state of the industry, where we are today, how we got here, kind of where we're going. Then we're going to switch gears into how the tile industry fits into the trajectory of green building. And then we're going to focus on, there's been a lot in the news having to do with material health. In case you haven't seen, a lot of opportunities for gaining market share for the ceramic tile industry in light of some of these events, but also a lot of opportunities for us to dig deeper into what we need to continuously improve on. So I think recent events are a big component of where we're heading in green building. And of course, embodied carbon, kind of the big elephant in the room. What are we doing about embodied carbon, and how are we going to continue to have our A game when we come to the market, because it's going to continue to be important. So that said, I will hand it off to Wes for the first question because, Wes,
I've got a few slides to jump through first.
Yep,
Okay,
I
good.
will. So, but just to introduce
Oh, yeah, got it.
the topic here, obviously a lot of what we do on green building, everyone knows about LEED, and so that's one of the first things people ask. So inherently, Wes is in the trenches and knows a lot of kind of where we are today, what the priorities are for green building, being right in the thick of it with USGBC. So Wes, if you don't mind walking us through just kind of where we are today, how we got here, where we're going.
Thank you. The big green button, right? There it is. Well, thanks for that, and thanks for having us here. And thank you all for being here. We've probably all seen, who's seen a pie chart like this? So this is a map of, or a table of global CO2 emissions. And the part that usually gets the most attention is the operating emissions. So building operations, your energy used in the building. But in the last few years, there's been a bigger attention on that kind of highlighted part at the bottom, which are the industry and the materials that make up the buildings. And what we're starting to see, as you probably all are aware, is that the embodied emissions, the embodied carbon, is becoming an increasingly important and especially short-term source of carbon emissions, and there's a lot of tension on that. So climate change is kind of the number one thing that green buildings are trying to address right now, and embodied carbon is becoming, I'd say, one of the most, if not the driver of a lot of that conversation. So what you do in this space really matters. In addition to carbon, there's a lot of other impacts from materials that we're tracking. Resource extraction is beyond what the Earth can sustain generally. We have a lot of waste in the system. The construction industry tends to waste about 10% of materials. And then once we're done with that, a lot of those materials end up in the landfill. So these are all opportunities for improvement. And then lastly, once we make a product or a material, they don't just stay put. They migrate into people, the places where we make things and manufacturing ends up, there's pollutions in the air. That 95% is for mostly industrialized nations or industrializing nations. There's a lot of polluted air in those regions. So that all said, I don't mean to be a bummer, right? Let's think on the positive. Products, let's be honest, building products are not the cause of all these problems, not the responsible party for it, but they can be part of the solution to helping solve some of these challenges. So a lot of opportunities for how products and materials can reduce carbon, reduce waste, make things more efficient, and be healthier for people and planet. And that's where the LEED rating system comes in. Just a few numbers on the rating system. Who's heard of LEED? Okay, great. It's a 100-point scale rating system that's used globally to reward and recognize leadership, essentially. And for a long time, it's been really an energy efficiency has been the driver, but more and more, I'd say materials are having a moment, and there's a lot of discussion around that. But just some numbers that highlight the impact LEED has had. If we go one level deeper into the materials-related credits in LEED, we have a credit in there for environmental product declarations. You can get a point if you pick 20 on your LEED building, and you get 2 points if you pick more. But what we're seeing is that maybe 5-6 years ago, very few projects got that credit at all. This is an optional credit. But today, 82% of all projects achieve the EPD credit. And not only that, but 60% of projects earn material ingredients. That's a health disclosure for your products, or low-emitting materials for flooring and other finishes that do have some volatile organic compounds. You can get points for selecting those that are low-emitting. And those are some of the most popular credits in the entire rating system. So whereas those points used to be sort of nice fringe things to have on projects, now they're consistently some of the most used credits in the rating system. And here's another way to look at it. There's kind of from 2020 on the left up till today, there's been a steady increase. Those are a number of LEED projects worldwide. And I don't have the numbers here, but it's billions of square feet at this point that have selected EPDs, material ingredients, other types of these requirements for products. So what we're seeing is an increased and even steepening of that curve in terms of interest of these categories of products. And just a couple more here. LEED has been around since the 90s, and we are right now in the middle of an update to the rating system. So stay tuned. Later in the year, you'll have some more ideas of what's coming on the horizon. But the big I'd say the signal is, if you're doing things like EPDs and ingredient disclosure and low emitting, those are still going to be very important for LEED. The future could be something like this, where we have more multi-attribute products and materials. So things like a climate, human health, circularity, those are all things that we have solutions to today. And then more emerging topics like social equity and health in the supply chain and ecosystem health are areas where we're also looking to kind of reward optimization, we call it. And the role of LEED is really not to kind of bash people over the head with these things. It's to reward leadership and recognize it where we see it in the industry so that all products can be optimized around multiple attributes. And I'll leave on this slide, which is sort of maybe a teaser for all of us here to talk about. Today in LEED, we have these credits for EPDs, material ingredients, low emitting. But I think in the future, we may see some stacking of these things, a combination. So for certain product categories or types, what if you were required to have an EPD and have if it's a finished product that has some off-gassing, it needs to be low emitting, and you have to also have an ingredient disclosure. We're on the cusp, saying those numbers of those trajectories of points and credits, we're on the cusp of that being a reality as kind of a basic criteria now in 2023 for sustainable products. And what we need is more advancement on the optimized side, which you see on the bottom there. So maybe with that, I'll leave it and pass it back to you, Bill.
Yeah, no, thanks, Wes. It's encouraging to hear, that we tend to be on trend and continue to be on trend, and some of the things you said with transparency and performance, but then going into multi-attribute and optimization. That's what we've been striving for years. And maybe it's a perfect segue into William, because you're in the trenches, you're on the battlefield, working for a lot of the manufacturers in our industry. So they're asking you a lot of these very complex questions having to do with LEED, but much deeper into their sustainability strategy. So William, did you want to comment maybe a little bit on some of the things you're seeing? How are manufacturers doing? What kind of shape the industry's in?
Yeah, that last slide that Wes had up, I think the basic criteria is, I think, a thing that we're really seeing a shift sort of happen. So, I mean, really for the last 10 years, EPDs have been a thing, HPDs, declare label, have been a thing that you give to an architect, lead project team, and it's sort of a check the box kind of handoff. I have an EPD, here is my EPD. That's the end of it. As it goes, it's a collect them all kind of thing. You needed 20 or 40 EPDs or HPDs in order to obtain the LEED credit. We're seeing a shift really in that optimization, but people are actually starting to read these documents, and Václav will talk a little bit about that, but they're using the information in different ways, and the market for that is changing, which is probably the most interesting part. So LEED has always been a nice to have. It's been, I think a lot of our manufacturing clients would talk about it like a segment. 5 to 10% of our sales are LEED specified projects. It's not all of them. It's not our Home Depot business or our Lowe's business or our Floor and Decor business. It's its own segment. It's the Genslers and the Perkins and Wills and so forth. So it's a niche-y little compartment of the full customer segment. And so I think this basic criteria is one of the things that we see happening and shifting is EPDs are sort of becoming like a must-have. We've got regulation in different parts of the country in different states, 38 different states and municipalities in the United States, but also sort of global requirements. So there's in the European Union, it's now a regulation going into effect in 2025 that EPDs and material health information and recycled content and about 7 different attributes have to accompany building products with these things in this legislation called ESPR, digital product passports are the term, and it's under the new Green Deal in Europe. So it's no longer like a 5 or 10% of the market for LEED. It's like law, right? And so I think that's really one of the key things to kind of point out that I'm seeing is that the stakes have gotten higher because it's starting to move into regulatory. It's not a nice to have, it's a must have. And so that puts a lot on manufacturers to make sure that it's their disclosures, right? Like you own your disclosure. So, making sure that you're putting your best foot forward when it comes to the carbon footprint, making sure that how would somebody read your HPD or declare label and thinking about that in terms of, advanced criteria or optimization. So I think those are really those are big moments right now that I think are really impacting manufacturers. I tell the story. This is going to be a lot like three things come to mind that are similar. One, nutritional labeling, like on the side of packaging, is something that came full-fledged in the 90s. It's really not that old to know, there's 140 calories per serving on the side of a food product. Early 2000s, the idea of knowing the calories in a fast food item. I go to Starbucks and I buy a iced caramel macchiato with 2,000 calories. It now tells me that that's 2,000 calories, and I can decide if I want to, have my daily limit in one morning drink. Three is the idea of safety data sheets, MSDSs, right? We talked about that. Very simple. That was that was a thing too that came, within the last 25 years. The idea that we're going to share information about, hazards for every single product that we make, and have to put it in a binder. So if Joey splashes himself in the face, he knows what he needs to do in order to not have his face melt off. These are all new things that have promoted disclosure. They've been regulated, and I think carbon and materials are kind of right there as the next things.
Can you talk about disclosure for just a moment, and maybe some of the acceptance of maybe some of our efforts and some of our TCNA members' efforts on material ingredient reporting? Because I think that'll be a nice tee up for Teresa.
Yeah, I think tile is really well positioned. We industry-wide LCAs and EPDs that have made it easier for manufacturers who participated in that to have their own product-specific EPDs. I think that's one thing that TCNA has really helped lead, along with different manufacturers supporting that effort. So there's a rapid path on that. Material ingredient guide would be another one. So this was a project that TCNA members helped make happen. That basically helped sort of work out the nuances of how to disclose on things that come from the earth, right? I talk about if I scoop clay from this hole and move over 100 feet to another hole, it could have slightly different characteristics, chemically and molecularly. But does that have to be, worked out to the T, or can we come up with some, kind of averages and normal case scenarios in order to make disclosures on things that are a little complicated to figure out exactly what's in them? That paired with some green screen assessments, this largest collection of green screens positions tile to be able to talk confidently about what's in tile, which I think is a really advantageous position compared to other flooring mediums. Tile probably shouldn't be as afraid to disclose as maybe in other industries. And then green squared, I think, is the last one. Green squared really pushes manufacturers to show, reduced carbon footprint, optimized, energy and plants, all these things that kind of connect to the vehicles that are important in the market today. And so I think manufacturers who obtain green squared certification are probably a little better positioned to have, lower carbon footprints in their EPDs, and probably better awareness about the chemicals and ingredients that are in their products.
Yeah, oh, great. And in years past, we were focused on VOCs, we were focused on recycled content, regional availability, some of the single attributes, but we've certainly trended towards this multi-attribute approach, and even one step further, the idea of optimization. And so on the material ingredient, I guess I'd say from our viewpoint, there's two huge topics facing us today: human health and embodied carbon. And I think we did a miraculous job kind of bringing the industry together to say, here's on average what's in our products, and not only fully disclose what the industry is using, but also optimize. And so the idea is transparency, and the idea is, as you just put it, I think one of the things, William, you like to say to me quite often is ingredients you are familiar with, ingredients you can pronounce. We're talking about sand, we're talking about clay, we're talking about minerals, we're not talking about polyvinyl chloride and all of the derivatives. And so, to that end, I think we're in a good shape. We need to continue to be transparent. And I'm curious, from HBN's viewpoint, how much we're being noticed, in your views on kind of what we're doing and how we can do better, maybe some of the things that we've hit the nail on the head on, but certainly some challenges we have as well. Be interested to hear.
So there's a lot to be celebrated, I think, and recognized in terms of how far we've come from, in terms of disclosure, both from embodied carbon perspective and EPDs and in material disclosure. We think that flooring in general, what we see is that flooring in general as an industry is well out and ahead of other building product industries in terms of those disclosures. And ceramic tile is right up there with the leaders in terms of who's participating. So I think there's lots to be celebrated there. I think one thing that I think like the next step would be to talk about how do you optimize, as is up on this slide, and at HPN, we try to encourage project teams to think about the product type first. Before you identify the specific manufacturer, find a product type that is best in class for that product category. So when I say product category, I mean like flooring is a product category, or ceiling, or paints. Those are product categories, and product types are like linoleum flooring or ceramic tile or carpet would be product types within that category. And there's going to be product types that are going to be generally better from a material health perspective, as well as generally better from an embodied carbon perspective. And those leaps between product types are going to be bigger than you can make than leaps within a product type. So I try to use the example of William mentioned product labels. So let's picture you're in a grocery store and you're in the candy aisle. Like any product in there is probably not going to be the best for your health. You probably don't need to know if it's a Snickers or my favorite, the Reese's peanut butter cups. Like it's all probably not the best choice from a health perspective. But if you're in the vegetable aisle, like you're probably, whether it's broccoli or bok choy or whatever you're choosing, it's probably going to be better for you from a health perspective. And so similarly in the material health realm, we're trying to, our HBN, Healthy Building Networks, our guidance is trying to point people towards the right aisle of the flooring store. So products that tend to be preferred from a material health perspective are those that are either plant-based or mineral-based. So that includes ceramic tiles, tend to be better from a material health perspective throughout their product life cycle. Products that tend to be not preferred from a material health perspective tend to be those that are short service life and tend to be those petroleum-based products like vinyl tile. Vinyl has material health concerns at every stage of its life cycle, starting from the manufacturing where it's using asbestos or mercury or highly persistent chemicals in its manufacturing, and that carries on throughout its life cycle. So those tend to be, those product types tend to be worst in class. So we encourage people product type first, and then once you land on a product type that's preferred, then using your EPDs, your certifications, your HPDs to find the best manufacturer product within that product type. So that's our mantra. And typically, from a life cycle perspective, those that are preferred from a material health perspective, in large part, also are optimized from a embodied carbon perspective as well. So there's a lot of alignment there. Not always, but typically.
So are you saying then, using the grocery aisle analogy, so let's say you've got a vinyl tile on the candy aisle, right? And you've got ceramic tile on the vegetable aisle. Are you saying once you've arrived at that candy aisle, you don't really care which vinyl tile you're getting or which, because we need to stop beating ourselves up within the aisle over the same differentiators that made you land at that aisle. Similarly, if you arrive at the vegetable aisle, let's not worry about which vegetable is healthier than the other vegetable. You're in a good aisle to begin with. Is that the focus?
Yeah, I think those are the biggest leaps that you can make, are choosing the right aisle. And then once you're in that aisle, there are incremental changes or incremental differences that you can continue to improve. And I'll talk about that a little bit later, about how, like, within the sort of like tile aisle, how you can continue to improve. But that's the best place to start, is to get pointed in the right direction. Right from early design, project design, is getting in the right aisle.
Yeah, so philosophically, if I could get on my soapbox for just a moment, I do think that we struggle from time to time as an industry, beating ourselves up and trying to differentiate between products within the same product category, when in reality you're already in that vegetable aisle. So then let's let cost and branding and personal preferences prevail, because that's what we've always been strong at. Let's not compete with each other on who's healthier or who's got the lower carbon footprint. I think we need to do that to some degree to keep pushing us forward, but that shouldn't be the driver. We should need to not lose sight. And I'm bringing this up because it segues nicely, Václav. You know, I've been on my soapbox with building transparency quite a bit over the years on let's not worry about comparing so much the embodied carbon of one product versus another if you're in the vegetable aisle. We're fortunate as a flooring industry to have one single product category rule that includes tile, vinyl, laminate, wood, soon to be stone, all in the same PCR, which then enables you to compare them within the product category of flooring, not the product category of tile, not the product category of wood. And so I do think we have a nice stage set to start getting us to the right aisle, but I know we're not quite there yet. The good news is embodied carbon has never been more visible to the public than it is today. So I think we have a lot of resources to move this field forward. So you maybe want to comment on where we are with embodied carbon and what building transparency is doing and what the tile industry is doing with you guys?
Yeah, definitely. So I think I'll first start with some of the things that have already been said, where, you know, we've been doing whole building life cycle assessments for a while. We have been asking for environmental product declarations for a while as architects and engineers, but there's always been kind of a disconnect between the two. You could make sort of early design decisions, you know, and decide which particular product type you want to use within each category, but it would kind of end there, right? So you didn't have a next step in terms of actually verifying that anything that you actually procure on your project actually still is low carbon. In some of the product categories, it matters a little bit more than others. We, with the embodied carbon and construction calculator, started focusing on concrete and steel, which are obviously the largest drivers of embodied carbon. And there you can have large differences between the manufacturing impacts from one manufacturer to the next, right? So it makes sense to start kind of comparing just within the category itself and also focusing on the production stages themselves. And you really want to make this, investments into low carbon production processes kind of a competitive advantage across manufacturers. But again, that's more relevant in like the structural materials, concrete and steel. Architects are also asking about the embodied carbon and other environmental impacts of interior materials, mechanical, electrical, and plumbing systems, and other types of products. And so, we as Building Transparency are relatively new, on the scene since 2019. And so we're just diving into the interiors products right now with the help of the Tile Council and other interior associations. But now that we're kind of diving into this interior space, we're still collecting the EPD data, but it's also important that we start addressing some of the other life cycle stages and look at stuff like durability, maintenance, aspects, and then disposal. And as you mentioned, oftentimes, especially in the interior product space, the health aspects and the carbon aspects go hand in hand, especially because of the durability, because if something doesn't last as long, you have to produce more and more of it over the time that it's being in use in a building, right? So we're definitely going from the space of just doing separate whole building life cycle assessments, to just asking for EPDs, to now actually using the data that's provided within environmental product declarations and tying it back to whatever the architect made a design decision, and how that carries over towards procurement and the as-built impacts of projects, right? So so we're definitely moving towards the right direction and having more data, more information that architects and engineers can now use and start to make this low embodied carbon product space really a competitive market.
Yeah. So on the subject of longevity and considering the cradle to grave life cycle of a product, it's those of you who've heard me talk over the last several months have heard me kind of preach this, and maybe a little bit preaching to the choir, but it's quite a simple process or a subject to understand, but not so easy to communicate, because you get questions. Well, what if somebody changes it over? Then you're just gonna, it may last that long, but what if the public, doesn't keep it? So, I think as I've brainstormed on this topic, I think one of the ways to be a little better at communicating, and it hit me one night as I was just kind of thinking about this. The word that's used quite often is carbon accounting, right? So just like financial accounting, why don't we treat carbon like money? You can spend $100 on something that lasts 2 years, or you can spend $1,000 on something that lasts 10 years. As a consumer, if you get rid of that 10-year product after 5 years, shame on you. That's your fault. You swallow the cost, right? So it's the same thing with carbon. Instead of thinking about, it's going to cost me this much to replace it and replace it and replace it, let's just talk about the cost per year in the present time. So if if I have a $500 product that lasts 2 years, that's $250 a year that I'm investing, and then I'll have to keep doing that for as long as I keep buying $500 chunks. But if I have a $1,000 product, that lasts 10 years, that's just $100 a year for the next 10 years if I choose to follow through with the decision I made. So I think we can apply a lot of that logic to carbon, kind of the net present value of carbon. And so those are some things we've kind of stewed on. And I know, and so just to expand on the relationship, so TCNA and our members have invested our time and effort in creating a ceramic tile category in the EC3 calculator. So and if I understand correctly, it's launching this week, the pilot for this category. So we will have a category in the calculator so that you'll be able to output the embodied carbon of ceramic tile. As of now, those will be cradle to gate, A1 to A3 impacts. However, because that's, as you kind of alluded to with the history of concrete and asphalt and steel.
Yeah.
But I think the vision is to bring more attention to the A, B, and C. In other words, the B module is use phase, C module is disposal or end of life, and start to find out where we can incorporate that data more. Do you want to talk a little bit on kind of the building planner tool, and something I think as an industry we need to educate about so that people start using that, because it's a very powerful tool which will enable us to compare ceramic to vinyl to carpet outside of the traditional just find and compare tool.
Right. Yeah, definitely. Just a little bit more background about EC3 as well. I didn't mention it yet, but you have environmental product declarations, which are generally PDF documents. And so it's been really hard for people to, one, really understand what's happening in those documents, and then kind of transcribing the data and being able to use it for any type of calculations down the road. And so what we do with EC3 is that we digitize these PDF documents, we format them in a standardized format so that it's easily, you can easily find products that fit your performance criteria, and then so you can use different filters to find the right product. We also provide the data free to access to other tools. So if there's another whole building life cycle assessment tool, they can go and access our database of the data that's within these EPDs. And so in the past, it wasn't as easy to understand the ranges in the impacts from different manufacturers. And now with EC3, you can do that. Now, back to your question about the building planner. So finding products is just one part of the equation, right? You also need to have the material quantities that you're using in your project, and then you need to start addressing some of the other aspects, like how far is the product being transported to the project, what are the installation and construction impacts, and then we get into durability, replacement, maintenance, and end-of-life disposal. To date, in our building planner in EC3, people can easily enter material quantities for their projects and then link them with the environmental product declaration data. We also added recently the transportation and construction stages of the life cycle. And so we're slowly moving towards the whole carbon accounting aspect of this. But maintenance and replacement is something that we're still going to be adding, and it is one of the main tasks that we're working with the TAL Council of North America on right now. What's the best way of working that into the tool, allowing people to select the building lifetime, and then understand the service life of these different types of products, especially for interiors.
Yeah, no, great, thank you. That's helpful, and just so everyone can rest assured that we have a relationship with all the key players in carbon, embodied carbon now, and so we hope to move forward and do what's best on the because that's the goal, is to do the right thing and give people the right information, and we respect building transparency for that and all the effort you've put forward thus far. And to that end, I do want to commend building transparency, because EC3 has just kind of blown up in a short amount of time, right? You went from a small startup to where now you're written in policy,
yeah.
and referenced by the Inflation Reduction Act. So, we talked about carbon never being more publicly visible than it is today, and with embodied carbon, maybe we'll talk about that a little bit, and the urgency of addressing embodied carbon. Maybe William, I'll start. We can kind of go wherever, but if anyone wants to jump in, but the Inflation Reduction Act is huge. You probably know the $1 billion figures off the top of your head better than I do, but.
I think it's important just to understand the mechanics of what the Inflation Reduction Act did. I think there's one in a handful of categories: concrete, steel, glass, and asphalt. The idea is that the federal government has billions of dollars to procure low carbon materials. Move forward. What does low carbon materials mean? A common one. So there's two working directions. One was put a cap on it. Say, the number is 300. You got to show that you're below 300 to equal low carbon. If you're 301, you're not low carbon. That approach shifted to what Bill just referenced, where EC3 has been referenced, and basically there's an industry baseline, and then low carbon is the lowest 20 percentile in the category. If you can't find something that's in the 20 percentile, you move to the 40 percentile. If you can't find something in the 40 percentile, you move to the 80 percentile or below an industry baseline. That equals low carbon. So has some steps to it in terms of what that means. Again, right now that only impacts concrete, steel, glass, and asphalt. Should move into other categories. Higher emitting categories is why they focused on concrete, steel, glass, or asphalt. So that's kind of one structure. There's also in the GSA, there's a set of purchasing requirements called P100 that has a mandatory EPD requirement to sell into the GSA. So there's kind of two things. There's one where you have to have an EPD, sort of similar to LEED, check the box, must have in order to sell. And then two, there's this low carbon bucket of money to buy low carbon products. Again, tile not referenced yet, but that's kind of how those two fit out. And so I think the mechanics are important to know about the IRA, because we're seeing other purchasing groups do the same thing. So if I'm Amazon or Salesforce or somebody like that, and I want to purchase low carbon materials because I have a reduction goal that I need to reduce 5% embodied carbon on every project per year, I'm going to use the same sort of idea, right? I'm going to try to find that lowest 20 percentile, lower 40 percentile. To play off Teresa's candy aisle, it's like, and maybe I want to just go with my incumbent Reese's or Snickers, which would be my favorite. Maybe I know I should feel better and get the dark chocolate with the flavanols and the better for you, and I should avoid the pixie sticks and fun dips, because I just know inherently those are not great for me. So figuring out groups are working through their own definitions of low carbon procurement and ways to sort of acquire products that have lower footprints. And so that's kind of what's happening, I think, at the moment.
And so this is very much in progress now to be defined for the non-structural industries, for the finishes and the furniture and others in government procurement. And I say that because there's an opportunity. I think there's an RFI out right now through May 15th. May 15th.
May 15th.
So would encourage you all, if you're in the same kind of wavelength of thought as we are at TCNA, to submit some information and define this embodied carbon threshold based on a couple of things. We're certainly in support of this cradle to grave approach and not just manufacturing impacts, because honestly, from what we really believe is we need to stop incentivizing manufacturers to produce less carbon to make a product that lasts 5 years, that you're going to ultimately have more carbon over the next 2 decades. Same, again, thinking like money. Let's stop incentivizing manufacturers to make cheap products that aren't going to last long just because it's cheaper for you and the consumers will buy it at a lower price point. So, that's important. IRA has the power to kind of shift this market in one way or the other, for better or worse. And so that's one topic. And another thing near and dear to our heart on IRA is the candy aisle versus the vegetable aisle. You talked about the 20% lowest percent, or the lowest 20 percentile. Let's make sure that's 20 lowest percentile of the product category of flooring, not of tile. Because in that case, unfortunately, with industry averages, half are going to be better and half are going to be worse. And if you pick the best of the worst product category in lieu of the worst of the best product category, so if you pick the best carpet product over the worst tile product, you're going to end up, doing a disservice. So I think that's important that we define these aisles, these product categories. We call our product category flooring. We don't call it tile. And so that's something I think to keep in mind. I'd be interested in where USGBC stands on this, because it's some interesting talk, and we should talk more moving forward. And I think it's important that we have some harmony in our approaches so that we don't confuse the market.
Yeah, and it's very much fluid still. And like I said, version 5, we're writing it right now. And kind of seeing this landscape of where EPDs are headed. A lot of them have been cradle to gate for products, right? And at the same time, we want to see that full life cycle analysis. There's now more of a talk of what's called dynamic LCA, where you give more weight to those impact areas that have the highest kind of feasibility of actually happening. So something like looking at future energy grid, greening in your operations phase of your LCA is not as important of the fact that what you did right now to make that product that's very measurable. Or something like a replacement is more guaranteed than, again, maybe a future energy grid upgrade for your factory or something. And at the same time, end of life is another part, that some materials are more prone to be recycled or recovered and others are not. And that's something that there's a lot of speculation on in LCA. The more guidance on that, I think, is super helpful. And I think the other two things I would say is multi-attribute is still important. So we can't just have carbon blinders on. We have to also think, and this goes to the candy aisle, right? Maybe you're picking whatever. I can't follow that analogy too much farther, but if you're picking a good product, it's healthy for you and it tastes good, right? And it's the cheapest or something. Like, those are the things you want. You want the consumer wants more. They don't just want one thing. They want choices, and they like to have that. And the last thing I'll say, I see Ecomedes in the audience here, putting this all in a way that the consumers can actually make a decision in a way that makes sense. I mean, something we've learned is really important. Something we've learned in LEAD is it's really complicated out there right now. That's why it's easy to just check a box. We have an EPD. I don't know what it says, but we have an EPD. Select. I think the next thing is making use of that data, and that's what EC3 is doing and what Healthy Building Network is doing. They're starting to create tools. We need libraries that publish this stuff in ways that's easy to understand. Right now, it's really just not a very accessible, all these documents, to the general public. And I think that's what's hopefully changing and getting easier to understand. So communication is the other piece of it.
I want to follow up with one question just briefly, then I want to circle back to some of the human health stuff. But before we go there, we talk about multi-attribute a lot up here. And as most of you in the room know, we have an industry standard and certification program called Green Squared, which is an ANSI standard that identifies a lot of performance thresholds, kind of packages everything into one certification label. This is what the tile industry defines as a sustainable product. We have a pilot credit in LEAD currently where that's recognized. Can you just comment on the future of that credit and how you could envision Green Squared evolving to address things like human health, embodied carbon a little more, to be more kind of on trend?
I mean, we're still, again, in the weeds of the details, not much I can share, but that's the spirit of where we hope to go, is that those standards or attributes that do multiple things are what we're rewarding, kind of back to that pyramid I had up earlier.
Yeah.
Like, it's not enough just to optimize around one thing. We're looking for that multi. So if you've got like product standards that are doing that, I think that bodes very well for the future.
So we at least have something to drive, and so the challenge will be kind of working with USGBC to figure out how we can drive and keep kind of going in the right direction moving forward. We've always considered Green Square, the most important thing it gives us is a vehicle, and we can evolve that vehicle over time, but without the vehicle you don't really have much to work with.
Yep.
Great. So, clearly current events and IRA has affected embodied carbon, and even though those are dollars toward the public sector, we certainly see it driving the private sector as well, and it's in the news, it's in the conversation. Also in the news is a lot of plastic accidents and human health in general, which I think one of the things we observed in the middle of the pandemic, it kind of spiked human health interest and for obvious reasons. But it gave us an opportunity to really dig deep into our industry and find out what our priorities are and what our messaging is. Maybe I don't want you to steal all the thunder for the talk, Teresa, that you're going to give on Wednesday, but which I encourage all of you to go to. You're going to talk on kind of this very topic of plastics and all that you're hearing in the news and what the opportunities are for the ceramic tile industry. But you want to touch a little bit on it today, maybe kind of current events and how it's affecting everything HBN's seeing from a building and construction standpoint?
Yeah. So, how I kind of frame the conversation of plastics is our buildings are becoming buildings are becoming plastic buildings, and our buildings are becoming disposable buildings, and they're related. So as our buildings become more energy efficient, as our cars and our energy grids become more efficient, the oil and gas industry is finding other outlets for their product, and that outlet is petrochemicals, namely plastics. So increasingly, building materials of all sorts, not just flooring, but building materials of all sorts are having plastic materials introduced, and the scale is stunning. Taking flooring for example, carpet is one building product that's mostly made of plastic, and there's 1.2 million tons of plastic from carpet that's thrown out in the U.S. every year. So to put that in perspective, that's equal to every water bottle or plastic bottle, plastic bag, plastic straw discarded in the U.S. every year, and that's just one building material. So the plastic problem with building and construction waste is on par with the single-use plastics problem. And I think that's something that people aren't aware of. I don't think, at least when I did that math, it was shocking to me that it was on par with the single-use plastics problem. And so that's something we need to pay attention to. Vinyl is the biggest plastic material used in buildings. It's also, buildings are the biggest use of PVC itself as well. So that's why there's a lot of attention paid to vinyl. It's used in siding, it's used in piping, it's used in flooring, of course. And recent events, the train derailment that I think everyone's aware of in East Palestine, just highlighted the toxic chemicals that are used every day to produce vinyl. So vinyl chloride was the material that was spilled, and there's a 75% chance that vinyl chloride was destined for a building material of some sort, whether it's flooring or piping or whatever. So you could just imagine what the difference would be if that train was filled with copper piping instead of vinyl chloride, or if it was filled with ceramic tile instead of vinyl chloride. The conversation, it wouldn't have been in the news. It wouldn't have been a big deal for that community. It wouldn't be a problem that we'll be cleaning up for decades. And that's just, one incident. And in Indiana, there was a burning, waste plastic recycling plant. It's on fire. It's probably still on fire, as last I heard. And so we're starting to see all these sort of more public events, but this waste has been going on for decades, for as long as plastics have been being made. It's just becoming more front and center. So I think, if continuing to have this sort of holistic view of the life cycle impacts of these materials and understanding the costs of those upfront is going to be critical, and bringing more awareness about how much plastic is even in these buildings. I don't think a lot of people think about all the places where plastic shows up in our everyday lives. So it's something that I think we could all build awareness around as a collective.
So I think on the topic of awareness, I think you're absolutely right that if not for recent events, there wouldn't be so much public awareness and increasing public awareness around the harm of plastics. To that end, and for raising more awareness, do you foresee any synergies between HBN and some of the NGOs that are out there that are heavily focused on single-use plastics, with tons of reach in the public, whether it's marketing dollars, huge donors, and so forth? I think you all know the organizations we're talking about.
We're trying.
Yeah.
It's not for lack of trying. It's going to be. I think what's really driving it is a lot of the philanthropy dollars are really, plastics and oceans and fish and so they see the bottles and the visible waste. But the piles of carpet are not as visible to people. So I think it is just they're both really important problems, not taking away from single use at all, but it is where a lot of the time and attention is being spent right now, and it's buildings are under the radar, and I think that's a very comfortable spot for those plastics then to be used.
So I do have this dream of one day going to plasticspollutioncoalition.org or just pick your NGO, and just like they have plastic bags, straws, and other consumer products, having a tab that says construction products. And I don't think we're too far off. Maybe some more collaboration between HBN, industry, technical experts in the industry, and USGBC and others. Obviously, there's tasteful ways to do these kinds of things, but I think that's the challenge. It's just getting the technical information up there and getting the right people at the table to pull this off. So
yeah, that's
looking
right.
forward to more synergies moving forward.
Yeah.
What else, guys? Any closing thoughts here before we kind of turn it over to the audience? Go ahead, William.
I just want to go back on the IRA comment and just this sort of behavior of using this information for purchasing purposes or accounting purposes. I think a lot of attention is brought to the IRA, and it's an easy thing to just say, oh, those categories don't impact me. Again, the private sector, I think, is following suit. I like to say, if I'm a building owner and I'm trying to think about embodied carbon, I can't possibly do worse than the federal government, right? So I need to be better than the federal government. So using the same sort of behavior sets, but depending on your outlook on the real estate and building sector, you may see a shift away from new buildings, right? The core and shell stuff that concrete, steel, glass, asphalt are sort of attached to, and repurposing of existing building stock. So I think there's actually a really nice opportunity for interiors. Is we've built a lot of stuff in the last 10 years. That stuff may not be functionally right for how we need building stock for the next 10 years. And so a lot of repurposing of that space is going to create, I think, a huge opportunity for interiors as the same, cube is repurposed from an office into, residential, or a residential into something else as we figure out how we need the building stock. And so I would just, pay attention to that. The other part I'll say is one of the most interesting parts about the political will around the Inflation Reduction Act is sort of the opportunity it presents domestically. Other countries aren't necessarily in love with the U.S.'s approach to low carbon materials because it's a very America first perspective. The working hypothesis is if it's made in America, it's a lower carbon material than something that's imported. So that creates a lot of opportunity for U.S. Manufacturing, creates a lot of opportunity and investment. And this sort of, if you kind of follow the heels of, what was a very kind of public deal with tariffs and, import goods and maybe not fair practices in certain categories in other countries, paired with the supply chain chaos that came from COVID. Those things kind of line up that, made here, low carbon, are core macro strategies that I think are worth sort of, paying attention to.
Yeah. No, following up just for a moment on the end of life discussion, would be interesting to dive more. It's kind of that C module is one that it's been kind of a mystery over the years on how to position industry to promote the C module benefits. Yep. There's a lot of extended producer responsibility and different things like that, but it's never quite worked right. But I think human health for sure on the end of the life cycle for plastics, when you have incineration, disposal, and you have I think burn pits brought a lot of that to light, but when you got even just in a disaster like a burning building or a burning apartment complex, and that's an end of life too, the impact that has on a local community. So certainly from a human health endpoint, but I think there's opportunities to hone in on carbon too, because for those incineration, the carbon footprint's got to be huge, I would imagine, because you're burning petrochemicals. So be interesting to, there's a lack of research in these fields and what it means for the building and construction industry from a life cycle standpoint. So it'd be fascinating to dive into that a little more.
Yeah, I'll tell one story. Teresa may know some of this, that with a group last week, and insurers were brought up a lot. Insurers of plastics recycling facilities obviously have had a lot of issues. Chemicals of concern from an insurance perspective. The East Palestine train derailment's not going to be a cheap event. But one comment that was brought up is, change of climate change, more wildfires, fire goes through a community. All of that waste is treated as hazardous post-burn because nobody knows what's in the building. Yeah. And so for an insurer, that's very expensive waste to dispose of. So how could they know more about what's in the building stock to be able to determine if it is or is not hazardous is a pretty interesting. And there's lots of money, of course, not having to send stuff to hazardous waste landfills, which are not growing per se. Nobody wants a hazardous waste landfill in their backyard, so they don't just grow on trees. So there's that sort of compression too that I think you'll see maybe more use of disclosure related information to be able to figure out what's in buildings and things like that, similar to what's happening with embodied carbon. So there you go. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Fantastic. That's good food for thought for sure. I've been told we can go over just a little bit. If there's questions from the audience, want to engage you guys a little bit now. I'm happy to talk more. Yes, sir.
In terms of the transformation and progression within the U.S., how does that compare to the rest of the world and other regions? Are we leading that effort? Are we trailing behind other regions? Any insights into where we stand within the U.S.?
And this is in terms of carbon in general, or?
Yeah, our progression towards.
I think that's a great question. I think the way I'd answer it is, EPDs are definitely being used as like an international vehicle. So like that's happening in different places. I think there's just a lot of different. Europe has some, like I mentioned, that ESPR legislation about requiring these digital product passports. They've got a carbon tax program for manufacturers. A few of us were at Qualisair. Was it last year? Yeah, last year. And a lot of manufacturers were talking about the carbon tax, EU ETS credits in Europe, along with higher cost of energy were really big compressions on the market, and so they're using more financial mechanisms or taxes to sort of price carbon into the cost of a product. Where we're sort of using in the U.S. probably a little bit more of a carrot, like show me you got a low carbon product and I'll give you some money, and so we're sort of trying to incentivize the market that there's a market for low carbon products with billions of dollars tied to the IRA. And so I think that's some of our European counterparts have said that perspective, more of a carrot than a stick, is is sort of how we're approaching it, which is different. Other governments think that it might be a little unfair for trade, so we've heard a lot of different kind of perspectives on that. So I think the U.S. has a really interesting approach. I think almost a very American approach, but I think it's actually a pretty appropriate approach compared to some of what we're seeing in other countries. I don't know if that helps, but
I'll add from the lead perspective, we have projects all over the world, China, Europe, quite a few in India, Australia, some other places. And maybe 3-4 years ago, none of those projects were getting the EPD credit, for example, and now a lot of them are. So this has been happening kind of grassroots style in Egypt and stuff. There's been some key project, Mexico's another place, key projects that are driving manufacturers towards doing these. And now it's kind of starting to snowball as all the information that we're talking about, embodied carbon and such, has become more commonplace. So it's happening pretty fast. I'm surprised. We're starting to really see it happen. Yeah.
The change in the EPD space specifically has been really taking off over the past couple of years. I mean, Europe used to be at the forefront of that. Depending on which country you're in, different countries take a different approach. But Europe was always ahead in terms of how many EPDs were available there. Slowly, I think US, with a lot of this policy work that's now coming up, is quickly taking off. A lot more, interest in getting EPDs and understanding what does the life cycle assessment of my production actually tell me, right? And as you mentioned, even in Asia, Australia, we see a big push towards having more EPDs and understanding all of the environmental impacts of the construction materials much more. So it's quickly changing over the past couple of years all around the globe.
How about from a human health standpoint? Because certainly buildings aren't just getting more plastic in the U.S. In my observation, we have this carrot approach in the U.S. compared to more of the red list approach overseas. The stick approach. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, and I think where the U.S. is leading in materials disclosure. I think that's kind of kicked off in the U.S. And is being picked up now at other places. But certainly Europe's been ahead of the game in terms of installing preemptive regulations around materials, both around restricting materials as well as better understanding the hazards associated with materials with their REACH legislation, which has been in place now for, 25 years, something like that. So I think that's driving a lot of the understanding of hazards and the continued adding hazard chemicals to the restricted substances list, or their substances of very high concern, it's called in Europe. Whereas in the U.S., I think it's much more of a voluntary phase-out approach. So it was a voluntary phase-out for the vinyl industry to get out of phthalates in their flooring products. It's a voluntary movement away from some endocrine-disrupting chemicals in paints and cleaning products. So our regulatory structure isn't as strong here. And so that makes it a little, I guess it can move faster once they move, but it takes a while to get there.
Are there any other questions in the room? Yeah, Marcelo.
Hi. Transparency, plastic, tile, how we police ourselves to this representation of PPDs? I know Bill's opinion on this, but how the industry can do more to identify and police those situations?
So I think Marcelo's referring to kind of the non-conformance issue that we talked a little bit in the cab on the way to dinner last night. But the green guides are a perfect tool for that potentially. But do you have thoughts, Wes? How can the market police itself better to make sure EPDs can be believed?
Well, I mean, I hesitate to say, I guess third-party verification is becoming more and more standard. I mean, I'd love to hear from all of you too. Like, what do you think? I think there may be some good ideas in the room. But I do think like LCA, EPDs are still in their infancy. And it's funny because we're told not to compare products outside of their own product type or category, but that happens all the time. So I don't know. I think the answer is maybe verifying a third party or having some more strict requirements around EPDs. One of the problems I noticed that in the EPD world is there's not like an authoritative body that oversees all of them and says, these are the rules between categories, across categories for how you do your product category. It's sort of every industry group makes their own sort of rule, and you know this stuff really well. And I'm not sure we need an all-powerful like Oz of PCRs, but something like that would really help make it apples to apples. Right now it's a bunch of apples and oranges, and the challenge with LCA is you can kind of tell any story you want with them. So we need some boundaries and some rules around it that make sense.
I'll add. I mean, I think what happened with those EPDs appropriately being called out was kind of two things. One is we're sort of highlighting that people really hadn't been looking at them. It was like a collect them thing. But when you actually started to look and evaluate, some of these sort of issues, surfaced for the first time. I was fascinated more in the how did we respond? How did the EPD industry respond? What did UL do in that situation and so forth in terms of corrective actions? Can the EPD ecosystem, when called out for doing something incorrect, not following a PCR correctly, can it respond? And I think there's some of that did happen. Wes's point about an almighty being or power for EPDs. I mean, there's an extension for a certification body for ISO 17065 to have a EPD scheme. Program operator in question didn't do that, and I think that's a very important direction as the stakes get higher. That regardless of legacy, relationships in the space or legacy, that there's opportunities to make sure that as a manufacturer, you're selecting people with the right credentials to work with, and et cetera, so that you don't have those issues that could have potentially turned out to be a lot worse for those, rather than hey, it's in review and it's got to be fixed. I think.
And I think what William's saying is we need more market pressure for the certification agencies to be accredited to provide EPDs.
Yeah, and there's a lot that are. Not call it singling anybody out. I think that's the other opportunity is. Who is a program operator? Why can they be a program operator? What credentials do they have to be a program operator? They think these are the right questions to sort of be asking.
We've just about exhausted our time. We've more than exhausted it, but are there any other questions that we can address very quickly? If not, then I want to thank the panelists. I think this was fun. We covered a lot of ground, but it's enlightening, I think, for all of us to hear each other share views. And I hope we can continue these conversations offline and throughout the week. If you guys have questions, feel free to reach out. So.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you.